The air smelled of oil and salt. On the tarmac of a newly captured island in the Pacific, the heat shimmered above the metal wings of American bombers lined in silence. Japanese prisoners, among them nurses from a field hospital, were being escorted across the airstrip, their eyes lifted toward the roaring sky. Above them, a twin-engine B-25 Mitchell broke through the clouds, its polished fuselage catching the morning sun. As it banked and descended, the insignia of the U.S. Army Air Forces glinted sharply. And inside the cockpit, beneath a leather cap and goggles, sat a woman. Calm, focused. Her gloved hands moved over the controls with surgical precision. The nurses froze. One whispered a word that barely reached the air. Anna? A woman? In Japan? No woman flew a machine of war. Yet here, across the ocean, American women commanded bombers. For the first time, the face of modern war was not only male, and this quiet disbelief would echo long after the engines fell silent. When the United States entered the Second World War in December 1941, its military machine surged into motion with a scale unseen in history. Airfields expanded overnight. Factories ran without pause. But as millions of men were drafted into combat units, a quiet crisis grew across the home front. Who would ferry the thousands of new aircraft from factory floors to the front lines? The solution arrived not in the form of new technology, but in new courage, drawn from American women who refused to remain on the ground. In 1942, aviation pioneer Jacqueline Cochran, a woman already known in the pre-war racing circuit for her speed records, proposed a radical idea to the Army Air Forces: train female pilots to handle non-combat missions. The plan was initially met with skepticism, even derision. But necessity has a way of silencing doubt. Within a year, women were reporting to Avenger Field, a dusty base near Sweetwater, Texas, where they learned to fly the same powerful aircraft their brothers and husbands flew into battle. They were called the Women Air Force Service Pilots, the WASP. Their insignia bore a pair of silver wings crossed by a diamond. Behind that emblem was a simple creed: we live to fly. At Avenger Field, days began before dawn. The desert air carried the sound of propellers and shouted instructions. Trainees studied navigation, meteorology, and engine mechanics. They practiced formation flight, instrument-only approaches, and emergency landings. These were not symbolic exercises. Every woman had to master the full discipline of military aviation. The aircraft waiting for them were no gentle trainers. Some ferried P-51 Mustangs, sleek, high-powered fighters capable of more than 400 miles per hour. Others flew C-47 transports lumbering with cargo. A few, the most daring, sat behind the controls of four-engine bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress or the B-24 Liberator, ferrying them from manufacturing plants to departure bases along the coasts. They flew without weapons. They carried no bombs. Yet their missions were far from safe. Over 2 years of operation, 38 WASP pilots lost their lives, many to mechanical failures or weather that gave no mercy. Their deaths received no military honors. No folded flag was sent to grieving families. They were classified as civilians, volunteers in uniform. Still, their work was indispensable. By 1944, WASP pilots had ferried more than 12,000 aircraft, logging millions of miles across the continental United States. They transported cargo, towed gunnery targets, and tested repaired aircraft, freeing thousands of male pilots for frontline duty. Each takeoff was an act of quiet defiance against the cultural limits of their time. Many of these women had learned to fly in small-town airfields, often scraping together savings from clerical jobs or family farms. Some had never been outside their home states before the war. Yet now, they soared at the controls of war machines once considered symbols of masculine power. From above, the continent became a lattice of steel and sky. From below, factory workers often paused to stare, uncertain of what they were seeing. A woman stepping down from a fighter cockpit, her flight suit smeared with oil, her voice calm and disciplined. There was no parade, no camera crew, only the faint smell of gasoline and the sound of another engine ready to start. By the middle of 1944, word of the WASP program had spread beyond America's borders. Newspapers across the Allied world printed photographs of women standing beside aircraft larger than some homes. To many, it was a sign of America's unmatched industrial might, a country so rich in machines and manpower that even its women could command the skies. But across the Pacific, in an empire still ruled by traditional codes of obedience and restraint, those same images carried an entirely different meaning. They were not just surprising, they were unthinkable. And soon, the disbelief would not remain confined to propaganda leaflets or intelligence briefings. Japanese nurses, medics, and officers stationed in the Pacific would soon see it with their own eyes. Women in the cockpits of American bombers. While the United States transformed its skies into an industrial highway, Japan's vision of war remained bound to older traditions. From the emperor's court to the smallest island garrison, society was structured around duty, hierarchy, and sacrifice, but not equality. Women in Imperial Japan served loyally, but within strict boundaries. They were nurses, factory workers, or clerks. Many joined the Dai Nippon Fujinkai, the Greater Japan Women's Association, producing uniforms and bandages or aiding the wounded. Some volunteered for the Army Nursing Corps, often deployed in perilous conditions on the front lines. Yet none, not one, sat behind the controls of a military aircraft. The very idea would have been alien. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Service and Navy Air Service were elite male institutions. Pilots were drawn from noble families, naval academies, or specialized training schools where discipline bordered on ritual. To them, flying was not just a skill, it was a spiritual calling. The cockpit was a sacred space reserved for those deemed worthy of the emperor's mission. Even as Japanese engineers designed advanced aircraft, the Mitsubishi Zero, the Ki-43 Hayabusa, and later the Kawasaki Ki-61 Hien, the notion of women participating as aviators was never considered. Wartime propaganda portrayed women as mothers, nurses, and mourners, keepers of the home and the spirit of sacrifice. Their strength lay in endurance, not in combat. Yet by 1944, cracks had begun to show. The tide of war had turned sharply against Japan. Allied bombers darkened the skies over cities that once seemed untouchable. In hospitals from Rabaul to Saipan, Japanese nurses tended to the wounded and the dying as the front moved ever closer. Supplies dwindled. Rumors spread faster than news, tales of American machines, new weapons, and a war effort that seemed endless in its reach. Then came the whispers of something stranger. Reports filtered through intelligence channels and radio broadcasts. America was using female pilots. Some Japanese officers dismissed it as propaganda. Psychological warfare meant to humiliate. Others, particularly medical staff and rear-echelon personnel who intercepted fragments of American magazines or saw captured photographs, were bewildered. Could it be true? When U.S. forces began capturing Pacific Islands in 1944, fragments of this truth arrived with them. Abandoned airfields were found littered with American flight manuals and photographs. Occasionally, among the debris, were images of women in flight suits, smiling beside their aircraft. The documents were passed to intelligence officers, who studied them with disbelief. For Japanese nurses stationed near these forward outposts, the revelation would become far more direct. At Saipan, Tinian, and later Iwo Jima, U.S. engineers rebuilt captured airstrips almost immediately after victory. The islands became hubs for ferrying and staging aircraft. Among them, bombers flown in part by WASP pilots on delivery missions from Hawaii or the continental United States. When Japanese prisoners or wounded personnel were moved through these bases under guard, they sometimes caught fleeting glimpses of these women, climbing into cockpits, checking instruments, or simply walking the flight line. To the Japanese nurses, exhausted and disoriented from the chaos of defeat, the sight struck like lightning. Women, in command of the sky, in their homeland, the idea of female strength had always been defined by quiet endurance, not by mastery of machines. Yet here, across the airfields of their conquerors, they saw a different kind of strength. Mechanical, confident, free. It was more than cultural shock. It was a glimpse into another civilization's future. The image would haunt many of them for years. In post-war interviews and memoirs, several surviving nurses spoke of the strange foreign women who piloted aircraft, something they had believed impossible until that moment. Their astonishment was genuine, their tone respectful, even wistful. For them, the war had revealed not only destruction, but transformation. Because when they saw those women in flight suits beneath the Pacific sun, they saw something the Empire of Japan had never allowed them to imagine: the power of change. And that vision, however brief, would linger long after the last aircraft vanished into the horizon. War reshapes not only nations but the people who serve them. For the women of the WASP, the cockpit became both battlefield and sanctuary, a place where courage met isolation, and where every takeoff felt like a quiet act of rebellion against history itself. The human angle. Each pilot carried her own story, stitched together from fragments of an America at war. Some had grown up watching barnstormers loop through summer skies at county fairs. Others had learned to fly in the 1930s through the civilian pilot training program, one of the few gateways available to women. One was Gertrude Tommy Tompkins Silver, who disappeared in October 1944 while ferrying a P-51 Mustang from Los Angeles to New Jersey. Her body and aircraft never found. Another, Cornelia Fort, had witnessed the attack on Pearl Harbor from her trainer aircraft, barely escaping collision with a Japanese Zero before joining the WASP program. Each name reflected a human cost that often went unspoken. They were not warriors in the conventional sense. They did not fire weapons, nor command squadrons in combat, but they faced danger with the same quiet determination. Engine failures, storms over mountain ranges, long nights over featureless terrain. Each flight demanded complete trust in machines that could turn fatal in a heartbeat. Their uniforms were simple: khaki coveralls, goggles, leather gloves. Their pay was less than that of male pilots. Yet few complained. They understood their place in history, even if the world did not. Between missions, they lived in barracks at Avenger Field, a patchwork of laughter, exhaustion, and unspoken grief. Letters from home were shared like treasure. When a pilot was killed, her friends would often have to pay to ship her body home, folding her flag themselves. No military ceremony, no public acknowledgement. And yet, they flew again the next day, because the aircraft had to move, and the war would not wait. The technological angle. The machines these women mastered were among the most complex of their era. The B-17 Flying Fortress, with its 4 radial engines and intricate instrument panel, demanded precision and endurance. Many WASP pilots transitioned into these heavy aircraft after mastering single-engine trainers, a leap that required mental and physical discipline. Jacqueline Cochran, ever pragmatic, believed that if a woman could drive a car, she could fly an airplane, provided she had the will to learn. The Army Air Forces soon learned she was right. Reports from instructors noted that WASP pilots often handled long-range ferry flights with fewer mechanical incidents than their male counterparts. Their attention to procedure and patience under pressure became legendary within the Air Transport Command. Some women were even assigned to test newly repaired aircraft, missions fraught with uncertainty. Engines had been rebuilt hastily, controls recalibrated. A single loose bolt could mean death, yet they accepted the orders. "If it can fly," one pilot wrote in her logbook, "we'll make it fly right." They also ferried B-26 Marauders, an aircraft notorious among air crews for its difficult handling and landing characteristics. Male pilots had given it nicknames like Widowmaker. But Wasps flew it safely, often helping refine handling notes later passed to combat crews overseas. Their contribution was not symbolic. It was technical, tangible, and essential to the logistics of modern warfare. The training angle at Avenger Field. The training program mirrored the Army Air Force's syllabus. Cadets studied flight theory in crowded classrooms where maps hung beside blackboards scrawled with equations. Physical fitness was mandatory. Endurance runs in the Texas heat, marching drills, inspections. Instructors were often male officers skeptical of the entire experiment. Some made their doubts clear. Yet, as the weeks passed, their attitudes shifted. The women kept pace. They learned to execute instrument-only landings in fog and darkness. They performed formation drills at high altitudes and practiced emergency bailouts over the dry plains. One instructor later recalled his surprise. They didn't want exceptions. They wanted standards. Graduation ceremonies were simple affairs. No fanfare, just the pinning of silver wings and the reading of new orders. The women saluted, mounted the steps of their assigned aircraft, and vanished into the horizon, bound for bases across the continental United States. By the spring of 1944, the WASP program had become an operational backbone for ferrying aircraft from production plants to embarkation points. With every mission completed, they silenced another doubt. The war had turned their dreams into necessity, and necessity into proof. But as they took to the skies, the distance between their world and that of their enemies widened. In the Pacific, Japanese nurses and airmen still clung to traditions shaped by centuries of hierarchy. They could not imagine a woman standing in a flight line, much less commanding a bomber. Yet, thousands of miles away, the Wasps were doing exactly that, flying the machines that would soon appear over Japanese-held islands. The shock that awaited the Japanese medical staff was not born in malice or arrogance. It was born in difference. Two civilizations viewing the same sky through opposite lenses. And soon, that difference would take human form, when those worlds finally collided on the same airfield. The enemy's perspective. When Japanese medical staff and prisoners of war witnessed American women at the controls of aircraft, the shock was cultural, even spiritual. Japan's wartime ideology, rooted in the Bushido Code and centuries of patriarchal hierarchy, framed women as symbols of endurance and sacrifice, never as combatants or operators of machinery. To the Japanese eye, the bomber was a manifestation of national will, a flying temple of discipline and death. Seeing a woman, foreign and unbowed, step from its cockpit inverted that image completely. It was not only a gender revelation, but a sign of something deeper, that the enemy fought with a kind of social freedom that Japan did not possess. Captured diaries and post-war testimonies reveal quiet astonishment among nurses and medics. "I saw a woman pilot," one Japanese nurse reportedly told an interpreter after her capture on Saipan. "She smiled as if it was nothing. We could not believe it." The shock was not just about gender. It was about modernity. These women represented a society where technology had become equalizing, where skill could outrank tradition. The sight of a woman commanding a bomber underlined a truth Japan's leaders refused to admit. The empire was fighting not only a military war, but a cultural one it could not win. For many who saw it, the image of a woman aviator became a symbol of America's unstoppable momentum, a merging of machine and mindset that the imperial system could no longer match. The leadership. Angled behind the WASP program stood two women whose vision had defied convention. Nancy Harkness Love and Jacqueline Cochran. Both were accomplished pilots before the war, but they approached their mission differently. Nancy Love, a quiet strategist, founded the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, WWFs, in 1942 under the Ferrying Division of the Air Transport Command. She believed women could immediately serve as ferry pilots with minimal training. Cochrane, bold and outspoken, sought a unified program with full military status. Their rivalry was real but productive. Two approaches that eventually merged into one entity. The WASP, Cochrane, became the program's director, overseeing everything from recruitment to training. She was relentless, politically sharp, and often controversial. She argued constantly for military recognition, equal pay, and formal integration. Without her persistence, the WASP might have remained a temporary experiment. Her leadership style mirrored the machines her pilots flew, powerful, complex, and difficult to control. She faced opposition from male officers, Congress, and even segments of the public, who viewed female pilots as a publicity stunt. But she did not flinch. "We're not here to prove anything," she once said. "We're here to win a war." Under her direction, the program expanded to include more than 1,000 women, operating from 122 air bases. They delivered almost every type of aircraft in the American inventory, from nimble fighters to massive bombers, often under harsh conditions and with little recognition. Cochrane's determination also set the stage for future generations. Her fight for military status, though denied during the war, laid the groundwork for the eventual integration of women into the U.S. Air Force decades later. In Japan, the idea of a woman like Cochrane, commanding men, negotiating policy, shaping military aviation, would have been inconceivable. The cultural gap was absolute, and that gap, as the Pacific Campaign intensified, became one of the subtle but powerful contrasts that defined the Allied and Axis worlds. The moral and social angle back home, the WASP program, stirred controversy. Some men saw the women as taking jobs away from returning soldiers. Others doubted their capability, dismissing their flights as ferry duty. Newspapers alternated between admiration and mockery. One headline read, "Glamour Girls of the Air." But within the military community, respect grew. Ground crews began to salute them without hesitation. Air traffic controllers learned their call signs. Engineers trusted their reports. The novelty wore off, replaced by professionalism. Yet the moral question lingered. Could women truly be part of war? Not as nurses, not as workers, but as operators of its deadliest machines? The WASPs themselves avoided politics. Most were too busy flying to debate philosophy. But their existence raised uncomfortable questions about the world the war was creating. A world where survival demanded total mobilization of every skill, regardless of gender. In quiet ways, their service eroded centuries of assumption. Every safe delivery of a bomber was proof that courage, skill, and endurance were not defined by gender. Every salute exchanged on a runway was a small revolution in uniform. Meanwhile, in Japan, the moral framework of warfare remained rigid. Women's service was measured by sacrifice, not by action. As the empire's fortunes collapsed, Japanese nurses on the front lines were ordered to prepare for mass suicide rather than capture, the ultimate expression of loyalty. Against that backdrop, the sight of American women calmly piloting aircraft was not just shocking, it was subversive. It whispered that strength could take other forms: precision, mastery, freedom. When the war finally ended, and the stories of these women trickled across oceans and borders, they became quiet proof that modern war had rewritten what it meant to serve. The WASPs did not seek glory. They sought equality through competence, and in doing so, they became symbols far greater than the aircraft they flew. But their greatest test and their most defining moment was yet to come. Because before victory, there would be betrayal. the sudden order that grounded them all, just as the war reached its peak. By mid-1944, the sky above America belonged to women who had once been told they had no place there. Every day, dozens of ferry flights left airfields across the continent, small silhouettes against the endless blue, bound for staging bases on the coasts. The WASP program had reached its height. More than 1,000 pilots were operational. Between them, they delivered fighters, bombers, transports, and trainers to every corner of the war effort. In hangars across Texas, California, and Kansas, mechanics paused as the rumble of engines filled the air. A woman's voice came through the radio, steady and professional. Call signs beginning with W7, or Ferry Command, became as familiar as any squadron designation. The novelty had faded. The respect had not. Each flight carried quiet weight. Many of these aircraft were brand new, never tested beyond the factory line. Some had faults waiting to reveal themselves at altitude. Others required complex navigation across the Rockies or through storm fronts over the Gulf. The women relied on instinct, training, and the hum of their instruments. They learned to read the clouds as one might read scripture. One ferry pilot, Anne Baumgartner, became the first American woman to fly a jet aircraft. The Bell YP-59A, in October 1944. Another, Dorothy Swain Lewis, logged over 1,000 hours in fighters, often flying solo cross-country missions without radio contact. Each accomplishment was another crack in the barrier between what women were permitted to do and what they were capable of doing. But behind their triumphs lay exhaustion. The hours were long, the pay minimal, and the recognition non-existent. Still, they flew. They understood that each bomber delivered meant more crews ready for the Pacific, more strength at the front, and fewer delays in the great machine of war. As the Allied advance pressed closer to Japan, the ferry routes extended to the Pacific itself. Airfields on Hawaii, Guam, Saipan, and Tinian became waypoints in the enormous chain that connected American industry to the battlefront. Although WASP pilots were officially restricted from combat zones, the war's geography was changing faster than the rules could keep up. In the summer of 1944, several groups of ferry pilots delivered B-25 Mitchells and B-24 Liberators to island bases now under U.S. control. Their missions were brief: deliver the aircraft, sign the logs, and return home. But their presence left an impression. On these raw, newly captured islands, the first landings by female pilots unfolded before eyes that had never imagined such a thing. Japanese prisoners, nurses and civilians still held or recently captured, often worked near the airstrips under guard. They watched in silence as aircraft touched down in formation. Bombers bearing American stars, dust trailing behind their wheels. When the cockpit opened and a woman climbed out, sun glinting off her goggles, disbelief rippled through the ranks. To the U.S. personnel, it was routine. To their Japanese captives, it was a rupture in reality. An American Army interpreter later recalled a scene on Saipan. A group of Japanese nurses froze when they saw two women walking the flight line, clipboard in hand, inspecting a B-25 they had just ferried in. They thought it was a trick, he said. They couldn't understand how women were flying warplanes. The silence that followed was heavy. The war had already taken everything from them: homeland, comrades, faith in victory, and now even the order of gender seemed reversed. For the WASPs, it was just another assignment, logged and completed. But without knowing it, they had become a living message. Every flight they made was a declaration of the new world being born amid the wreckage of the old. By autumn, the WASP program had reached full momentum. The women were flying more than 1,500 missions a month, moving every type of aircraft the U.S. could produce. The Air Transport Command praised their efficiency. Commanders began requesting WASPs by name for delicate assignments. Some were tasked with towing live-fire targets so gunners could train. the most dangerous job of all. For the first time in history, the largest air force on Earth relied in part on female pilots. The American home front took pride in their existence, even as official recognition lagged behind. Magazine features showed them smiling beside their planes, their hair pulled back, their eyes hidden behind lenses that reflected sunlight and clouds. They embodied a paradox, symbols of modern progress born from the world's most destructive conflict. Yet at the height of their achievement, a quiet threat was forming. In Washington, as the tide of war turned decisively in the Allies' favor, bureaucrats and politicians began to question whether the program was still necessary. With thousands of male pilots returning from Europe, the Army faced growing pressure to cut costs and restore traditional order. For the women who had proven themselves in the hardest way possible, a new battle was coming. One that would not be fought in the sky, but in the halls of power. The WASP program had become a triumph of skill and necessity. But in late 1944, politics caught up with progress. The tide of war had shifted. Allied victories in Europe were accelerating, and the invasion of the Philippines marked Japan's impending defeat. With combat demands easing, the U.S. Army Air Forces faced an uncomfortable question: what to do with the women who had filled its skies? The answer arrived quietly, almost bureaucratically. On October 1, 1944, General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, announced that the WASP program would be disbanded by December 20th. The justification was simple. The need no longer exists for the women who had risked their lives ferrying bombers, towing targets, and testing repaired aircraft. The words felt like a betrayal. They were civilians again, stripped of benefits, status, and recognition. Their records would be filed away without honors, their names fading into administrative silence. At Avenger Field, the announcement fell like a weight. The war still raged across the Pacific. Bombers still needed to move. Yet the order was final. Their mission and their era was over. Jacqueline Cochran, who had fought tirelessly for military status, received the news with fury and sorrow. She wrote to General Arnold pleading for reversal, warning that to disband the WASP now is to destroy something that has become part of our Air Force. But the momentum of bureaucracy was unstoppable. The men were coming home, and the nation was ready to return to familiar patterns. In the final weeks of the program, the women continued to fly with quiet dignity. They delivered aircraft, logged hours, and signed off their orders one last time. On December 20th, 1944, the WASP program officially ceased to exist. There was no ceremony, no salute, only silence. Out on the tarmac, a group of pilots gathered beneath the West Texas sun. Their uniforms were worn, their boots scuffed. Some cried openly. Others stared toward the horizon, unwilling to let the moment end. One woman took off her silver wings and placed them gently on the ground, a gesture of farewell to the sky. While America celebrated victory, their story faded into the margins. No medals, no military funerals for those who had died in service. Their contribution vanished behind the curtain of public memory. But in distant places, their impact had already been felt across the Pacific. Japanese nurses and medical staff who had glimpsed these women at captured airfields carried their memories into post-war life. In the ruins of Tokyo and Nagasaki, as Japan began rebuilding under Allied occupation, stories spread of Onna Hikoshi, the women pilots of the enemy. For some, the memory stirred envy. For others, admiration. In interviews decades later, one Japanese nurse recalled, "It was like seeing the future, a world where women could do anything." That future was not immediate, but it had begun. As the war reached its final months, the skies above the Pacific grew darker with the weight of the B-29 Superfortress campaign. These were bombers the WASPs had helped ferry across the United States, massive machines of destruction that now bore the war to Japan's heart. In a sense, The women who had delivered them had extended the reach of war farther than they would ever know. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, the WASPs were scattered back into civilian life. Some returned to families and never flew again. Others continued as instructors, crop dusters, or commercial pilots. Though opportunities remained limited, many watched as male veterans received honors and benefits that had been denied to them. But they remembered. They remembered the feel of the controls under their hands, the hum of engines before takeoff, the smell of oil and dust at Avenger Field. They remembered the stares of disbelief from men, and from enemies who had seen them command bombers without hesitation. In private letters, they wrote not of bitterness, but of pride. "We flew when it mattered," one pilot wrote. "That is enough. History would take decades to catch up." In 1977, more than 30 years after their final flight, the United States Congress finally granted the women Air Force service pilots full military status. They were recognized as veterans, their service restored to the record of national honor. For many, the medals came posthumously. General Arnold, before his death, admitted what many had long known: "We owed them more than we gave." But for the women who had stood under Pacific suns and Texas skies alike, the reward had never been in recognition. It had been in flight itself, in proving that courage knew no gender. Their story ended not with applause, but with an engine's echo fading into silence. Yet somewhere, in the memories of those who saw them, American and Japanese alike, their wings never truly landed, because they had changed the sky forever. The war ended in August 1945, and the Pacific Islands were quiet once more. Bombed-out airfields lay abandoned, their control towers skeletal, runways cracked with weeds. The roar of engines, once constant, was replaced by the hush of ocean winds and the distant cries of birds returning to reclaimed forests. For the Japanese nurses and medics who had survived, the silence was profound. They had witnessed death, devastation, and defeat. And among it, glimpsed something unexpected. Women in command of aircraft, commanding war machines with calm precision. It had defied everything they had been taught. In post-war interviews, many recalled those moments with a mixture of awe and disbelief. One former nurse, stationed near Tinian, said simply, "We could not understand them. We could not imagine it. And yet, they were there, flying." Their astonishment was not mockery. It was recognition of skill, courage, and independence that had no place in pre-war Japanese norms. Across the Pacific, memories of the WASPs began to intertwine with the practical realities of occupation. Japanese airfields were rebuilt under Allied supervision. Aircraft were flown by men, not women. Yet stories persisted among veterans and survivors. Letters exchanged among nurses spoke of the women pilots, their movements, and the sense of authority they exuded. They had seen the impossible realized in flesh and metal. In the United States, the immediate post-war period offered little comfort to the women who had flown. Returning male pilots dominated airfields and the public imagination. The WASPs were civilians again, stripped of military status, medals, and recognition. Their sacrifices and contributions were relegated to footnotes in official records. Yet, their work had tangible consequences. The aircraft they ferried, B-17s, B-25s, C-47s, formed the backbone of the U.S. air effort. Their delivery enabled strategic bombing campaigns over Europe and the Pacific, freeing thousands of male pilots for combat missions. Each plane safely delivered was another piece of the Allies' vast, complex war machine. Among Japanese observers, the sight of these women left a lingering impression on morale and cultural perception. Soldiers and nurses, once strictly bound by hierarchy and gender expectations, carried home the image of women exercising authority and skill in a domain previously unimaginable. It became, in hindsight, a subtle psychological marker of America's industrial and social strength. the WASPs themselves quietly continued their lives. Some remained in aviation, becoming instructors, airline pilots, or flight test engineers. Others returned to ordinary civilian life, marrying, raising families, or pursuing careers far from the cockpit. Few spoke publicly of their wartime service. Those who did found the world unprepared to listen. The narrative of male heroism dominated newspapers, movies, and popular imagination. Yet, the memory endured. Among the Japanese nurses who had witnessed them, the women pilots were remembered not as enemies, but as symbols of capability and progress, a reflection of a society where merit could surpass convention. Their influence was subtle but real, shaping conversations about gender, ability, and potential long after the guns fell silent. Even in archives, where documents gathered dust, the flight logs, training manuals, and photographs told the story of skill, courage, and quiet determination. They proved that the war had not only destroyed old worlds, but had glimpsed new possibilities for both the victors and the vanquished. And as the islands healed, as former airfields crumbled back into jungle, the image of women pilots walking calmly along a runway in the Pacific sun remained a testament to human capability, a fleeting encounter that bridged continents, cultures, and assumptions about gender. For the Japanese nurses, the experience lingered as a quiet, almost impossible memory, the day the enemy's women took to the sky. And for the WASPs, the memory was of flight itself, control, mastery, and endurance, moments that would never be replicated in ceremony or medal, yet remained unbroken in their hearts. While the Pacific Islands slowly returned to nature, the story of the women Air Force service pilots continued, quietly, invisibly, and, for decades, largely unrecognized. Back in the United States, the nation shifted from wartime urgency to peacetime expectation. Male veterans returned to the skies, to factories, and to headlines. The women who had flown bombers, fighters, and transports were civilians once more, their contributions unacknowledged by the military. Their wartime service remained classified. Official records listed them merely as civilian pilots. Even those who had lost their lives in service received no military funerals, no folded flags. Yet the WASP's impact was tangible and enduring. The aircraft they had delivered formed the backbone of the U.S. air war, from the European skies over Normandy to the Pacific island hopping campaign. Every B-17, B-25, and C-47 safely ferried across thousands of miles represented countless men freed for combat. Every cargo plane moved essential supplies, and every mission completed ensured the momentum of Allied strategy. Over time, their story began to resurface. Veteran pilots, historians, and surviving WASPs recounted tales of courage, professionalism, and precision that rivaled, and sometimes exceeded, that of their male counterparts. They spoke of flights across deserts and mountains, of engine failures in unfamiliar aircraft, and of the quiet confidence that earned the respect of ground crews and commanding officers alike. In Japan, decades later, survivors and historians reflected on those fleeting encounters with women in uniform. The nurses who had once stared in disbelief at female pilots carrying bombers across the Pacific spoke with admiration and respect. They were unlike anything we had ever imagined, one nurse said in a 1960s interview. They were calm, skillful, fearless, and they were women. These recollections highlighted not only the shock of difference, but the universality of skill and courage. Recognition in the United States took much longer. It was not until 1977 that Congress finally granted WASP pilots full military status. They were awarded veteran status, and surviving members could now receive medals, benefits, and official acknowledgement. Jacqueline Cochran, who had fought tirelessly for their recognition, lived to see the honor restored. Though many of the women she had led had already passed, their legacy extended beyond medals. The WASPs shattered long-standing assumptions about gender roles in aviation and the military. They proved that women could fly large, complex aircraft under pressure, often exceeding the standards set for men. They became a model for post-war integration of women into the U.S. Air Force and later the broader military. In the broader cultural imagination, their story inspired generations of women to pursue careers in aviation, aerospace, and defense, fields once considered exclusively male. From commercial airlines to test piloting experimental aircraft, the precedent set by the WASPs resonated for decades. Meanwhile, the memory of Japanese nurses who had witnessed them remained a subtle, enduring echo. For many, the image of a woman walking calmly along a runway in the Pacific sun, clipboard in hand, symbolized a quiet revolution. The power of skill over convention, determination over expectation. Even in societies slow to adapt, that memory lingered, a testament to courage in motion. Ultimately, the WASPs embodied both the pragmatism and the audacity of total war. They were volunteers who transformed necessity into achievement, courage into proof, and opportunity into history. Their story was not one of combat heroism in the traditional sense, but it was heroism nonetheless, quiet, disciplined, and enduring. And though the world initially overlooked them, history would remember. Not only as pilots who delivered aircraft, but as pioneers who reshaped what it meant to serve, to fly and to lead. As the Pacific Islands grew silent, as the forests reclaimed tarmacs and abandoned runways, the echoes of their engines lingered, a symbol that courage knows no gender, and that the sky belongs to those daring enough to take it. War is often measured in explosions, victories and losses, in territory gained and lives lost. Yet, sometimes its truest legacy is quieter, almost imperceptible, a moment that shifts perception, challenges expectation, and expands the horizon of possibility. The women Air Force service pilots embodied such a legacy. They did not drop bombs in combat. They did not lead squadrons into enemy fire. But in their hands, machines of destruction became instruments of progress, training, and proof. They carried the war across thousands of miles, freed men for battle, and, in the process, reshaped the understanding of what women could achieve. For Japanese nurses on the Pacific Islands, these women were a revelation. They represented a world outside the rigid strictures of imperial tradition, a society where merit, skill, and courage were not limited by gender. To witness a woman commanding a bomber in the sun-baked Pacific was to glimpse a future yet to arrive, a future in which ability would define roles more than custom. That astonishment, brief and fleeting, became part of the enduring memory of the war. An image lodged in minds that had seen devastation, yet recognized possibility. The WASP's story is a testament to quiet courage. They trained, risked, and endured, often without recognition, reward, or acclaim. Their greatest victories were invisible to the world: the safe delivery of an aircraft, the mastery of a new skill, the defiance of expectation. And in that mastery, they altered history, not with headlines, but with wings. When the sun rises over a Pacific tarmac or a Midwestern airfield, it illuminates more than metal and glass. It illuminates courage. The courage to fly when the world doubts you, to take to the sky when it belongs only in imagination, and to leave an indelible mark on both history and human consciousness. In the end, the image remains: a woman stepping from a bomber, goggles reflecting the horizon, calm, composed, unstoppable. She carries with her a lesson far larger than any warplane: that courage, skill, and perseverance know no bounds, and that the sky belongs to all who dare to claim it. And in that quiet, timeless moment, history itself takes flight.